Hello, Peter Padden here for the Cricket Path video podcast. Today's podcast is about biblical references in traditional witchcraft. There's been a lot of discussion recently about the various paths or traditions of witchcraft, and it's been noted more than once that certain traditions seem to carry a lot of biblical lore within them. For those who grew up in and escaped repressive Christian communities, that can be very awkward, as they tend to reject anything Christian. So why are there traditions with material of apparently biblical origin? And is this a good thing or a bad thing? Let's start by examining some of the better known examples. But first, some history. By the 11th century, pagans and craft practice in Britain was in a pickle by all accounts. The more or less enforced conversion to Christianity had been going on for some 600 years, and while a great deal of the old law was preserved, however imperfectly, by the monks who wrote down the stories from the oral traditions, the dangers of being openly pagan caused families to draw themselves in and keep what they had within the safer boundaries defined by blood relation. This both preserved a measure of tradition and spelled its doom. Without interaction with other traditions, if a family lost someone unexpectedly, which was a common occurrence in that age, they frequently lost a portion of their lore as well. So there were traditions that became fragmentary, and families that didn't so much follow a tradition as they had quaint family traditions followed with little or no understanding. Ironically, it was the Knights' Crusades that changed all of this, at least for some families. Knights from families with enough of their tradition left to be considered actively pursuing the mysteries found themselves in Palestine, among a people with a rich esoteric heritage of their own. Although it was a different culture and different paths, they saw things that resonated with the fragments they knew from their family, and they gathered up whatever they could get their hands on and took it home with them. This latter point is generally accepted by academics who study such things, though the earlier part is, I admit, speculative, and based more on tales I've heard than cold hard evidence. But it sort of fits. Pieces of Palestinian lore, whether they were from Jewish, Islamic, Sufi or other sources, were used to fill the gaps from these families, and as they were already masquerading as good church-going folk, it wasn't that much of a stretch to add these elements to their lore and practice. As time went on, this lore got integrated, and the likes of Tubal-Cain, Lilith, the Watchers, and even the Devil became staples of these traditions, until finally, in modern times, we find traditions such as the cult of Sabati, the clan of Tubal-Cain, and the various Luciferian traditions that are either built on the remnants of these family traditions or are recreations of what went before. This poses a dilemma for the modern crafter, who sees any apparently Christian influence as inherently bad, mainly because the assumption is usually that the material is of biblical origin. Now, just because something is mentioned in the Bible doesn't mean necessarily that that's where it originally came from. I was recently involved in a passionate discussion on this subject where someone who I respect deeply commented that, okay, the material is older than the Bible, but why would you drink from a tainted well like the Bible and the church when you could go to purer sources? Ironically, while many of these topics do get a mention in the Bible, few if any are discussed in any depth or detail, and it only takes a moment to realise that the source material the Knights brought back was not likely to be of Christian origin. In fact, even though it's likely that the biblical references were used to educate members of the family, it is equally likely that the older sources, as they became available, would have been devoured by the practitioners. You only have to look at the voracious appetite many modern crafters have for seeking out sources for lore to understand that as the Babylonian, Sumerian, Akkadian and other material finally became freely available, crafters who were used to encountering Tubal-Cain, Lilith and the Watchers would be reading up on the tales of the Anunnaki. In a sense, the mentions in the Bible almost end up as a blind to the true origins of this lore. So let's have a closer look at the craft understanding of this body of lore. Let's start with Tubal-Cain, a descendant of Cain who was himself the son of Adam and Lilith by some accounts. Old Tubal was familiar to many in British society long before Robert Cochrane and the clan of Tubal-Cain. He was the master artificer in Freemasonry, and the subject of that well-known poem by Kipling. Jubal sang of the wrath of God and the curse of thistle and thorn, but Tubal got him a pointed rod and scrabbled the earth for corn. Old, old as that early mould, young as the sprouting grain, yearly green as the strife between Jubal and Tubal-Cain. Jubal sang of the new-found sea and the love that its waves divide, but Tubal hollowed a fallen tree and passed to the further side. Black, black as the hurricane rack, salt as the undermain, bitter and cold is the hate they hold, Jubal and Tubal-Cain. Jubal sang of the golden years where wars and wounds shall cease, but Tubal fashioned the hand-flung spears and showed his neighbours peace. New as 9.2, older than Lamech slain, roaring and loud in the feud avowed twixt Tubal and Jubal-Cain. Jubal sang of the cliffs that bar and the peaks that none may crown, but Tubal clamoured by Jat and Scar, and there he builded a town. High, high as the snowsheds lie, low as the culverts drain. Wherever they be, they can never agree, Jubal and Tubal-Cain. That was by Rudyard Kipling.